Hi, thanks for joining us today. Today, I'm talking to Caroline Masucci, who is a mental health therapist at LifeSpring Counseling Services. Today, Caroline will be talking with us about anxiety and phobias. Welcome, Caroline.
Thank you so much for having me.
So, Caroline, talk with us about what made you drawn to helping people with anxiety and phobias.
I think that I can personally relate. I have experienced anxiety throughout my lifetime and had my own treatment for it. And so now I feel drawn to helping others.
Yes. And, that's certainly a good reason, right?
Mm.
It's relatable. And there are so many people who experience difficulties with anxiety. It's one of the most common things that we see bringing people to our office. So, a lot of people coming in for that very reason. So, Caroline, talk with us a little bit about anxiety and what might bring someone in. The reality is that we all experience anxiety at some point. We have all experienced nervousness. So, how does someone know when their anxiety is becoming a problem?
Yeah, I think that it's when it impacts functioning, right? So when it keeps you from doing the things that you'd like to be doing or doing them in the comfort level that you'd like to have. That's when it really maybe it's something that you need to address. Yeah.
And can you give some common examples of how this might show up and impact functioning?
Yeah. So I think that there are a number of different forms that anxiety can take. Maybe it's generalized anxiety where you just have excessive worry. You're just constantly worrying throughout the day. And then more specific anxiety where it can result in like a very specific fear. Maybe something happened that has created this fear of driving, or I've had clients afraid of all sorts of different things.
Hmm.
So I don't want to limit it, but it can get very specific. And then there's also panic disorder, which you break out in a panic attack out of the blue, and then that can induce this anxiety around, well, when will it happen again? And so it takes on all different forms.
Yeah. And I think that that's important to know that anxiety can look different for different people, right? That there's a
Hmm.
lot of different ways that anxiety can present itself.
Yeah.
And so when your clients come in and they're meeting with you for the first time and they're telling you what's going on, and you know that it's related to anxiety in some way, what are some of their most common concerns?
Mm. Oh boy. I think that it would be, well, I often hear that it affects sleep.
Hmm.
Usually it creates some depression, right? Because it's exhausting to be worrying constantly. Um, I have some clients who experience anxiety attacks, but not always within generalized anxiety. Um, just this worry that consumes much of their day. Yeah.
Hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And ways that that might impact someone, right? If we're thinking about that worry that's showing up, what are some ways that you see that impacting people's daily life? What are you seeing? How are you seeing that impact people's functioning? How are they seeing it impacting their daily lives?
Yeah. It can look like a difficulty concentrating, irritability, which can affect their relationships with loved ones,
Hmm.
performance at work, or sometimes it can prevent sleep, affect their appetite, um, hmm, all sorts of different ways. And particularly with specific phobias or fears, it can prevent someone from doing something that they once loved, like
Hmm.
driving a car or getting on an airplane and traveling.
Hmm.
Mhm.
Yeah. Absolutely. And in our case, even maybe going to the Eastern Shore, since we're here in Maryland, there are even
Mm.
some van driving services to help people get across the bridge, right? So a lot
Yeah.
of different ways that those things can present. But I think it's important to know the different things that can show up around anxiety, right? How many people would maybe think about irritability and
Right.
anxiety, right? And so people might be experiencing these things and not necessarily know that this is related to their anxiety.
hmm All too often, I hear surprise around that.
Mhm.
And I work with children and adolescents too, and actually, that's usually the number one symptom is
Mhm.
irritability, right?
Mhm.
Um, and I think that that makes sense in that anxiety is exhausting and also sometimes overwhelming. And so, of course, we
Mhm.
lash out.
Sure. And even in terms of that being exhausted and then being able to lay down at night and then not be able to sleep because your wheels are turning and now you have racing thoughts.
Right. And then you're hungry, but then you also don't really want to eat. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
hmm
Yeah. So the important thing to know is that even though some of those things can be really difficult, exhausting, overwhelming, and they can have an impact on your daily life, the other thing we want people to know is that there is help available. S- So, and that's where you come in. So, tell us a little bit about some ways that therapists who specialize in anxiety can help people.
Oh gosh, there are so many different coping skills, related to breathing and mindfulness and living within the moment. And there's progressive muscle relaxation. But I think that aside from all of that, there's also some um, cognitive reframing, right? So changing our mindset, changing our perspective. Um, when there's specific fear, there's exposure therapy, which I know sounds really scary. And sometimes I have clients will be like, oh, that's the thing where I do something really, really terrifying until it's no longer terrifying. And it's like, well, it's not that scary. It's actually very gradual. So it's a little bit scary and then a little bit more scary. And hopefully when we get to the highest, the scariest scary thing, then it's not so scary because you've done all of these steps beforehand.
Mhm.
And so it's a gradual process.
Yeah.
Mhm,
Now, Caroline, I know that you've had a lot of success. You've seen a lot of success using gradual exposure. Can you talk a little bit
mhm.
about what you've seen in terms of people making progress?
Oh yeah. I mean, I think that it's a game changer, right? So, um, we'll usually set a plan, right? So we'll identify what the fear is or what the overarching issue is, and then we work to identify ways that we can build to it on a scale of like, okay, we want to test the limits a little bit. We want to create a little bit of distress, and then we want to order it so that we're doing the least amount of scary first,
Yeah.
um, and build up on it. And I think that through that, it takes a lot of rapport between the client and I.
Mhm.
That alliance is really important. And so I think when there are a number of clients that come to mind where we don't start out with exposure therapy, we start out with getting to know one another,
Mhm.
so that they can really trust that everything will be okay.
Yeah, I was just thinking about that as you were talking, right? It sounds really scary, really petrifying,
hmm
going in, even gradually doing this thing that you're really scared about, but also remembering that you're doing this in the context of a relationship where you trust the person that you're working with, where you know that you have support, that yes, you're taking these steps, but you're not taking these steps alone, and that you have someone who's supporting you and guiding you along the way.
Exactly. Exactly. And then through that self compassion, when, maybe you're not quite ready for the next step and, you need to work up to it a little bit longer, right? So there's all of these complexities within it. But, and then for generalized anxiety, we may not choose to go that route. We may do some CBT or something of that nature.
Mhm. So let's talk about that a little bit because some people may not have any idea what you're talking about. Like
Mhm.
CBT, what in the world are you talking about? So tell us a little bit about what that is and how that can help people who are dealing with anxiety or worry.
Sure. So it's cognitive behavioral therapy. And it's all about kind of connecting our thoughts, our feelings, and our behaviors. And so if we affect change in one area, we'll affect change within the others. And so, if you're always worried about what others may be thinking about you, well, then you may want to test that a little bit. And so I always say to my clients, let's argue with that inner voice a little bit, kindly, not aggressively, but kind of, argue back and ask, like, what is the validity behind that? Like, how true is that? And then what proof is there to the negative thoughts? And then what facts are there to kind of suggest otherwise?
Yeah.
It's kind of a mindset shift. Yeah.
Yeah. Which can, be a process, right? When I think about sometimes the negative thoughts that people experience or the self-critical thoughts, sometimes they're so easy to just accept and believe that they're true. And we've never been given the idea that maybe they're not. And maybe we do need to argue with those beliefs a little bit. And I sometimes find that even though our goal is to help people recognize when a thought is not accurate, not helpful, or not true, that when we're thinking about thoughts or helping them work on thoughts that are more accurate, more realistic, or more helpful, that sometimes we really argue with the helpful thoughts. Like they really want to make sure that that more positive thought is true, right? Even though we don't argue the same way with the negative voice in our head. We're just like, yeah, it must be true. I'm not a great person. We really kind of test when we're trying to change our thinking. That's where we're really questioning. Can I believe this other thing?
That's such a great point. So true.
Yes. Yeah. So know that we're not gonna help you go to the other end of the spectrum and be overly positive and think things are not true.
Well, sure. And I mean, and why do we have anxiety, right? I mean, it's there for a reason. It's to keep us from doing dangerous, scary things, right? Like we should be anxious when in front of a bear out in the woods, but then there's also anxiety that's maybe not so necessary any longer.
Yeah. Well, I'm glad you say that because I think sometimes we think about emotions as being good or emotions being bad or they're positive or they're negative. And I hear you saying maybe there's a different perspective and that even anxiety serves a purpose. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, something that I find myself saying to clients over and over again is to go ahead and, and I don't even know where I got this phrase, but eat the frog, do the uncomfortable. So go ahead and sit with the anxiety a bit to retrain your mind, to show your mind that you don't necessarily need to be anxious, that it's safe, that it's okay, that you're going to be all right. So yeah, eat the frog.
Yeah, I'm sitting here laughing a little bit because we were doing a different episode recording this morning and we talked about the same thing. We were talking about eating the frog in a slightly different capacity, but this seems to be a theme for today.
Yeah. Yeah.
So on that note, I'm wondering, sometimes in therapy, there are these themes that just because they're so common, they just keep coming up over and over again. And sometimes we think that it's unique because it's our situation, not knowing that this is actually very common. This is a theme that comes up a lot that people experience. And so I imagine that there are some things that you are regularly saying to people. And I'm wondering, what are some of those things that you find yourself saying to people regularly?
Oh, I think that what comes to mind first is this encouragement for my clients to be self-compassionate, right? To give themselves the same grace that they give to others. I think that we can sometimes be our own worst critics, and it contributes to anxiety and depression and all sorts of things. But I think that we need to argue a little bit with that.